Hello, everybody. I'll shortly get started. I see there's a few people joining still now. Welcome to the 6th installment of the Swiss Treatment Planning Group webinar series. Today, we're discussing image registration and dose mapping for treatment planning and its application in the re-irradiation setting. Today I'll be your host. My name is Madeline Day and I'm a dosimetrist at the University Hospital of Zurich, and I'm also a board member in the Swiss Treatment Planning Group. We are able to be found by email, on LinkedIn. You can scan the QR code to find out about any other. Yeah.
Are you sharing the screen? Sorry, because
Are you not able to see the screen? Sorry. I thought it was being shared. Sorry. Yep. You can find us on LinkedIn. You can follow the QR code there, where you can also find links to previous webinars that we have recorded and uploaded to YouTube. We can also be found at the SASRO annual meeting. And you can always write to us at our email address in case you have ideas for future webinars or are wanting to get involved in the organisation of the group in general. Today, we are joined by Chelmis Thiong'o, and she is going to present to us about image registration and dose mapping. Chelmis is currently in her final year of her PhD in cancer sciences, focusing on developing methods to enable safe and effective re-irradiation of head and neck and lung cancer at the University of Manchester and the Christie Hospital in the UK. She's also been an active member of the Estro Medical Physics Working Group on re-irradiation, and recently was the author, the first author even, on the paper titled Dose Mapping and Using Image Registration for Re-irradiation, a Systematic Review. So today, Chelmis will give us an overview of her work, focusing on dose mapping and image registration, and present to us recommendations presented in her recent publication. So I will stop sharing and hand over to Chelmis. If you have any questions during Chelmis's presentation, you can already put those questions in the chat, and I will monitor them throughout the presentation, and then we will do a Q&A at the end.
Thank you, Maddie, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm Chelmis, a fourth-year PhD student at the University of Manchester. Today, I will be talking about a piece of work that has been central to my research. I will base this talk on this published paper, Dose Mapping Using Image Registration for Irradiation. This work is one of the outputs from a working group formed during the Estro 2022 physics workshop, specifically the image registration sub-working group. I have taken liberties to include some aspects of my PhD in my illustrations. In recent years, technical advances in radiotherapy have enabled high-targeted radiotherapy to well-defined volumes while maximally sparing healthy tissue. However, even though we are getting very good at treating cancer, we see tumors coming back or new tumors developing in areas that have already been irradiated. For example, nearly half of patients with primary head and neck or lung cancer experience recurrence within 2 to 5 years of the initial treatment, mostly within formerly radiated regions. Re-irradiation is a potential treatment option for these patients, and it's either a new radiotherapy course where there is geometric overlap with irradiated volumes of previous courses, or a new radiotherapy course where there are concerns of toxicity from the cumulative doses without overlap of irradiated volumes. Re-radiation is increasingly common. In this setting, cumulative dose assessment is essential to balance tumor control with toxicity risk. There are challenges though. One of the challenges is the need to know very precisely how much dose was given to estimate how much more dose we can give to avoid severe side effects. And we often don't know how much dose normal tissue already received, or how much recovery has occurred, or whether cumulative dose constraints are reliable for individual patients, and consequently, how to safely and reliably sum doses between different treatment courses, because the damage caused by radiation from previous treatment remains within the healthy tissue and organs. There is also the idea that a patient's anatomy may have changed. They may have gained or lost weight. They may have had surgery. If they were children, they may have grown up. An adult's posture may have changed, or other anatomical changes. To account for changes in anatomy, we can align corresponding elements of two different images. If we place them on top of each other, they may not align completely, such as the edges in this image. But if we allow for more degrees of alignment through deformable registration, we can end up with a transform that better aligns the source and destination CT scans. However, some anatomical changes that are typical in the re-radiation setting challenge the assumptions at the underlying common registration algorithms that we have right now. Another challenge with deformable registration is that different deformable registrations can result in a plausible dose mapping, with each plausible map resulting in different mapped dose distributions. So what we end up with is inconsistencies in mapped doses. The objective of this review was to systematically evaluate how image registration and dose mapping were performed and evaluated in the re-radiation setting. We were particularly interested in reporting the registration methods used, the evaluation strategies applied, the radiobiological aspects, and uncertainty quantification. Following this, we highlighted gaps and offered recommendations for future work. Article search. The article search included those containing image registration, dose mapping or dose accumulation, and re-radiation, or other variations of these keywords. We then embarked on a process to select relevant articles. We identified 1,127 articles to begin with. And then after excluding duplicates and non-English articles, we remained with 830 whose abstracts were reviewed to exclude articles which were not relevant to the subject or had other applications of image registrations or were not to do with re-radiation. This left us with 42 papers and 31 abstracts. We then excluded 9 articles. One was an abstract which had missing information, and 8 papers were excluded because they used image registration and they were in the re-radiation setting, but they were not mapping dose across different treatment courses. So what we ended up with was 34 papers and 30 abstracts, and 8 of these abstracts went on to full papers. Despite an open timeframe on the search, the first full publication in this area appeared in 2004, with a notable gap before more consistent publication activity starting in 2013. I imagine that since May last year, there have been more papers that have been published and more abstracts. All full articles performed CT to CT image registration, and most studies were retrospective with a fairly even distribution between methodological investigations and outcome-focused analysis. A few prospective studies selected primarily evaluated clinical tools or dose escalation strategies rather than the registration methodology itself. The majority of the studies focused on one single anatomical site, mostly lung and head and neck, with fewer studies addressing other regions or mixed site cohorts. In terms of image registration, both rigid and deformable registration methods were reported, with deformable registration being more common in recent publications. However, reporting of algorithm type, the parameter settings, and software versions was somewhat lacking. Some papers mentioned these details, others did not give any details at all. And in some cases, the specific software and algorithms for deformable registration were not mentioned, and this greatly limits reproducibility of the work that has been published. Geometric evaluation is a measure of whether the image registration performed well. And this is important because if a registration is unreliable, then we cannot trust its consequently mapped dose, such as the case with the spinal cord in this patient and in this registration. Unfortunately, only 1/3 of studies reported quantitative geometric evaluation metrics, and the commonly reported metrics were dissimilarity coefficient and other distance-based measures. However, many studies relied solely on qualitative visual assessment of the performance of the registrations, and even fewer studies provided per-case geometric performance results. Some of the limitations of geometric metrics, however, are that there are metrics such as the dissimilarity coefficient, which primarily evaluate volumetric overlap, and geometric agreement does not necessarily imply accurate dose mapping. Here is an illustration. We have this patient. We have run 2 deformable registrations, with each registration resulting in a plausible dose mapping, but we see there are still some inconsistencies in the mapped doses. Ideally, we'd hope that only reliable registrations are used for dose mapping, and the mapped dose is evaluated, and that there is explicit mention of the uncertainties in the mapped doses. Very few studies, however, evaluated the mapped doses following registration, and when dosimetric evaluation was performed, it often involved comparing dose volume histogram metrics before and after mapping, and watchwise evaluation was rare. There are different ways to report uncertainties, such as DVH metric uncertainty, or DVH plots, or watchwise spatial uncertainty, and among others. But in the studies we selected, only 7 reported uncertainties. And in the mapped doses, most of them used local neighborhood dose estimates or DVH differences to approximate misalignment effects, but 3 studies had watchwise uncertainty either through dose gradient-based evaluation or by repeating registrations and analyzing variability. I'd like to point here that we did have a revision between the first time we submitted the paper and the second time, and we had to perform the search the second time. And at the second search, that's when we captured vote-wise uncertainty estimation. In terms of radiobiological factors, there are three main aspects: dose conversion to radiobiological equieffective dose, or alpha beta values, and recovery factors. Most papers converted dose to an equieffective dose using either EQD2 or BED, although reporting in abstracts was less consistent, probably because there is not much information that you can give in an abstract. The order of conversion and mapping varied, and in several studies it was not clearly described. The alpha beta values were reported in most full papers, with the consistent use of 10 gray for target volumes and 2 or 3 grays for other organs at risk, although some studies applied structure-specific values or did not specify them at all. The recovery factors or dose discount factors were mentioned in only a few studies, and there was no standardized approach to incorporating tissue recovery. From this review and internal discussions, we identified six major gaps in the literature. The first was geometric evaluation of image registration in the irradiation context remained insufficient, with no consensus on relevant metrics or standardized implementation. The second was the evaluation of uncertainties in both deformable registration and dose mapping was limited, and reliability across different sites and dose gradients had not been very well established. The third is that there were no reports evaluating deformable registration and dose mapping beyond the use of external beam radiotherapy followed by external beam radiotherapy. And the fourth was there were no studies characterizing deformable registration or dose mapping performance in certain areas such as pediatric irradiation, including considerations for normal growth. The fifth, there was no consensus on the correct order of dose conversion relative to spatial mapping. And finally, the robustness of image registration in atypical anatomical situations such as post-treatment changes, post-immunotherapy changes, remain unexplored. Addressing these gaps is essential to enable reproducibility of studies and improved clinical reliability of the use of image registration in dose mapping in the irradiation setting. We then came up with some recommendations, invited 29 experts to participate in the prioritization voting session. Any recommendation which had at least 75% voting was considered a priority in either the research setting or the clinical setting. All 10 recommendations we came up with passed the 75% threshold in the research and development context, which reflects a strong consensus that transparent reporting of the registration pipeline, the dose conversion methods, the uncertainty estimation, and failure cases, among others, is essential for scientific rigor and reproducibility. In contrast, only 3 recommendations, the ones highlighted in bold, passed the 75% threshold in the clinical context, and those were reporting equieffective dose conversion, reporting repair or recovery factors, and documenting failure cases. The voting panel was highly experienced and multidisciplinary, with most participants having more than 10 years of experience in radiation therapy. So in summary, we performed a systematic review aiming to report what was done in the field regarding the use of image registration for dose mapping in the irradiation scenario, identifying methodological gaps and proposing recommendations to improve reproducibility in the clinic and research. We identified 34 articles and 30 abstracts, which showed a lack of comprehensive evaluation, both geometric and dosimetric, as well as a lack of uncertainty estimation. We also identified underrepresented areas in the research, including multimodal imaging, proton therapy, and pediatrics, and concluded that clear, consistent reporting and evaluation of image registration methods, supported by 3 clinical and 10 research recommendations, was essential for reliable, reproducible, and safer irradiation practice. I wish to acknowledge the Swiss Treatment Group for this invitation, the co-authors, my supervisors, and the audience. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Chelmis, for your presentation. If anybody has any questions, you can put those into the chat. Chelmis, what other aspects have you been looking at during your PhD in terms of dose mapping and image registration?
The main focus of my PhD has been uncertainty estimation, and in that I've looked at whether I've developed methods and a tool to check whether we can compile uncertainty information in the dose mapping process. And if you presented this information to clinicians, whether they would find that information reliable and possibly change their clinical decisions based on that uncertainty information. The work is still ongoing. I have 2 more clinicians to get their opinions on. But so far, there has been positive feedback on the value of presenting uncertainty information in dose mapping in the irradiation setting.
For sure. And would you say that that's something that's relatively quick and easy to produce, to present to the clinicians? Is this something that you think would be possible to implement clinically in the near future, or is it something that's still requiring a lot of time and resource?
I think it is easy, but I would say that this is from a naive point. I think it is easy to implement because the method is developed on a commercially available treatment planning system. And whilst we still need for safety purposes to perform things like risk assessment and all of that, if a clinician says that they trust the information that has been presented to them and as a highlight to this work, the data that we've been getting from the uncertainty tool I've developed is comparable to what they have been manually calculating. I think it's an easy implementation and definitely saves on time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and potentially you could use that to maybe you would limit your dose tolerances based on the uncertainty that you have in your dose mapping or something to that effect.
Yeah.
At least you know what you're getting into.
Yeah. And you maybe can potentially change, well, this is very hopeful, but you can potentially change the treatment intent of a patient with the uncertainty information.
Yeah, that's a very good point. At the moment, I don't see anything in the chat. I'm just going to share one last slide with everybody. Feel free to put any additional questions there. if you have them. Otherwise, just the links again to where you can find the Swiss Treatment Planning Group. And our next webinar will be in May and will be presented by Sarah. And she will present on a multi-center evaluation of treatment planning quality in stereotactic brain radiotherapy for brain metastases. And that was done within Switzerland. So the sign up link is already available there, so feel free to register. Otherwise, I would like to thank you all for joining today, and thank you so much to Chelmis for presenting for us. Have a very good afternoon, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.